Okay, so we're recording.
Welcome to the educational debt we owe to all of our children. Dr. Damon A. Means is a 23-year veteran of school administration, 12 years of which were as superintendent. He has led urban and suburban school districts, most recently for 3 years in Athens, Georgia. There he served as superintendent of Clark County School District. It's a district of 14,000 with 74% of the population were are students of color. An agent of equity and change, he focused on eradicating the academic opportunity and access gaps in the Title I school district. Before Clark County, Dr. Means was superintendent of the Mequon-Thiensville School District for 9 years. His passion and talent for school-wide leadership steered him out of the classroom, where he began a rapid rise through the ranks of education administration. Before becoming superintendent, he served the district in multiple positions. He has courageously led educational equity efforts in Wisconsin from district to state levels to equip all students, but in particular historically marginalized students, with greater access and sense of belonging. In 2010, Dr. Means was appointed by former Governor James Doyle to represent Wisconsin on the Education Commission of the States, a national educational policy consortium. Although the Mequon-Thiensville School District is high achieving in the aggregate, Dr. Means appropriately pointed out the need to focus on the district's achievement gap. To that end, Dr. Means, along with fellow superintendents, established the Closing the Achievement Gap Consortium. Dr. Means is a leading authority and consultant on diversity, equity, and inclusion, DEI, with a track record of identifying and addressing discrepancies, building action plans to ignite diverse hiring, and enforcing buy-in from disparate stakeholders. He has experience creating and implementing DEI training and awareness programs, in removing roadblocks standing in the way of establishing a corporate reputation as an industry leader in DEI hiring and advancement. He is a skilled partnership builder, connecting valuable partners as they work toward greater equity, inclusion, and social justice. In 2014, then State Superintendent Dr. Tony Evers appointed Dr. Means the chair of the Department of Instruction's Task Force on Promoting Excellence for All. That's the Wisconsin Task Force on Closing the Achievement Gap. The findings from the task force have been used statewide to assist schools in addressing persistent achievement gaps. Throughout his career, Dr. Means has been a strong advocate for equity and social justice. A sought after meeting facilitator and author, he created the Center for Equity and Leadership last year to extend his support beyond the school districts with which he works daily. Means earned his doctorate as well as an MS in educational leadership from Cardinal Stretch University and a BA from Concordia University of Wisconsin. He's married to Kimberly Means. They have one daughter, Hannah. A couple of housekeeping items before I turn it over. Please place your questions in the chat box to be addressed after the presentation. Next week, the topic will be restorative health equity and reparations, the intersection, presented by Curtis Marshall, public health consultant. Dr. Means.
Well, thank you. I hope I live up to uh, the the introduction and understanding that Dr. Marshall is going to be presenting next week. I'm simply here to warm up the audience for Dr. Marshall. He's a good friend, and I saw a couple other familiar names in the room here. So I just want to say hello to everyone. And I apologize for having to run away right at the 7 o'clock hour. I think Miss Jefferson announced it as my wife and daughter, but they're my bosses, and we have a new puppy. My daughter's name's Hannah, so we thought we would get a dog, a name, the dog with an H. So his name is Hudson, and she ran into the house and said, "Daddy, Daddy." The dog ran away as her mom and Hannah were trying to take him out. So that's why there was a slight emergency. I think my wife was on the track team in high school. She still has some speed and caught the young puppy. So um, thank you all for being here. I really do want to make this more of a conversation. So I hope to make some points, and then hopefully we can open it up for discussion's sake. In terms of sharing my screen, I'm going to try to share it now. Can everyone see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, I see some nodding of heads, so
Yeah.
that's good.
Everyone's muted.
That's good. So yes, that's the best I'm going to get is nodding of heads. So the title of our presentation tonight is "The Educational Debt We Owe to All of Our Children," and I have a perspective that we have to stop using the term the achievement gap, and that there's an achievement gap. And you'll see there's a slide I have a little bit later in the presentation, but the achievement gap, that language in essence puts the blame and responsibility on the children and families that we serve. If we approach this work more as there's a debt that society owes children that we haven't properly served, I think we can advance the work. And so what I want to do today is unpack what is educational equity, discuss the concept of educational debt, what will it take to achieve our collective goal, and then talk about next steps. Okay. I don't know what happened here. So try it this way. Okay. I think one of our hosts has the annotation tool on, so we're scribbling on the slides just as a side note. And so I'll try to see if I can erase it. Okay, good. So the question is, what is educational debt? Educational debt is defined here in this slide. And educational debt is the issue of making sure that every child receives whatever he or she needs to develop to their full academic and social potential. What it means is that every child has the right to feel loved and cared for, that they belong to a community of learners. Educational equity also means that there is no predictability of success or failure that correlates with any social or cultural factor. A child's educational experiences and outcomes are not predictable because of their race or their ethnic background or their ability to speak a language or their economic class or their religion, gender, sexual orientation, physical and cognitive ability. It shouldn't be associated with any of those things. Ultimately, educational equity means that we as a school system and as taxpayers, the people who are supporting school systems, are ensuring that kids receive what they deserve and they need on a daily basis. So that's educational equity. And so when you consider what is an achievement gap, the achievement gap is the issue of us blaming students and their families for the failures and the gaps that have emerged. And so what I mean by blame is that when you talk about the achievement gap, we typically have this conversation of here's what children are not doing. Here's the deficit that children have. And what we should talk about, and that Gloria Lansing Billings, who's a professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, she's a Kellner family endowed chair of some really important work that's happening at UW. She wrote a piece, she wrote an article in 2006 that promoted the idea of educational debt. And she worked with an economist from UW. And the economist said that educational debt is the foregone schooling resources that could have been and should have been invested into low income children, and that deficit of us not giving those children what they need and deserve just continues to exacerbate and grow and grow. And eventually what happens that we end up directing the resources that those communities and children need in other forms of social support, either through law enforcement. We do it through subsidies with food and other things instead of investing in their education. And so if we took the perspective that the society owes children, or there's a debt that we owe children, especially children who have been historically marginalized by our society, instead of saying, look at these children, they're not achieving at the same level as other children, and then casting a deficit based view on those children, that is a different way of looking at the work and looking at how we should proceed with education. So I like to show this graph because it's really interesting. Now it's about 5 or 6 years old now, but there's something that that you should all know, and that is there's an assessment. It's called the PISA, and the PISA is an assessment that is given globally. Now we administer this assessment throughout the globe, and when you look at the United States average, you can see it right here. That's where we, as a nation, land when you look at all the industrialized nations in the world. You can see Canada there is the number one nation on the PISA. The United States in the aggregate, when you count all children, we're right in the middle. But when you separate out and disaggregate the data, you will see that white students are among the leaders in the world. And then you will see where Latino and Black students are located on this same assessment. I think many of you may know, you may not know, and I appreciate Ms. Jefferson's very kind introduction, but the state of Wisconsin for the last decade has been considered the worst place in America to raise a Black child. And that's according to a study that was done a few years ago by the Annie E. Casey Foundation. There's also a national assessment that we give children every 2 years or so in this country, in the United States. And on that national assessment, the national test, if you will, the state of Wisconsin for the last 10 years has ranked as the lowest state in terms of the performance of our African American students. In short, you can see on this slide, not only do Black students, African American students, have a challenge in terms of the educational debt, I would say, that Gloria Lansing Billings would say, that are owed to them. But then when you localize it and look at the state of Wisconsin in particular, we are the worst. We're the 50th out of 50 states in the United States. So this is a quote that I like to utilize often. This Victoria Burkhart is a educational leader, and she has used this phrase often with education.
Yeah, I want to get back in bed.
It's shift change. Can you give us like 20 minutes?
Sure.
Okay.
I just
And the quote is
20 minutes and then call, and then we'll get you back in bed. We're just changing shifts right now.
okay.
Okay?
That's fine.
Thank you, my dear.
Yeah, I didn't know you were.
7 and 7.
Okay.
Okay.
So the quote is, your organization is perfectly designed for the results you are getting. Your organization is perfectly designed for the results you are getting. What that means is that as leaders, and you're all leaders on this call, our society, our organization is getting the results that we were designed to receive as either a society or as an institution. So I don't know how many of you've ever seen these cartoons before, but I like to reference them often. You will see the first cartoon is a slide of or imagery of equality. Equality is making sure that everyone gets the same thing. Everyone receives the same treatment. And so that's when I get a little worried when I hear teachers say, well, I treat all the kids the same. I don't want teachers to treat all the kids the same. Kids have different needs. And you can see if you are that young person with the purple shirt under equality, you can't see the game. You could not see that baseball game in any way, shape, or form. Equality, on the other hand, equality is when you make sure that people receive what they need, what they need. And in the case of the young person with the purple shirt, they may need 2 or 3 boxes. The person with the red shirt may need a little bit more. But that's equality. And it's interesting, during the summer of unrest, I saw a lot of people say, well, we want equality. I don't want equality. I want equity. But if we're really striving to do our very best, then we should provide an opportunity to liberate people. We should liberate them and take away all of the barriers and take away all of the limitations that hold people back. And so that's really, I think this is important. And what I would ask you to do and just reflect on the schools that are in your community, the schools that your children or grandchildren attend. What I would ask you is, what do you think is happening in that school? Do you think there's equality happening, equity, or liberation? And that's what we should always ask ourselves when thinking about education. One last note I want to just make about the issue of either educational debt or achievement is that ultimately there are home factors, and I don't want to ignore home factors. And there are school factors, and we can't ignore school factors. But in the middle, and Richard Milner, who is a good friend and a great author, if you want to read about educational equity even more, he likes to say that in the middle of these 2 very important factors of the condition of the school and the home life is teaching. That teaching can be the common denominator that can really change things. That's the one middle part that we can control. I like to always tell principals and staff members, teachers, that we always have to focus on what we can control. And when we focus on what we can control, that's when change really happens. And so let's talk about that change. If we're going to make the change, we need transformative leaders, not transformational. I'm going to talk about that in a second. Not transformational, but transformative leaders. Transformative leaders make certain things the center of their work. One, they make the center of their work dismantling structures and conditions that marginalize children. The second is they make the issues of inequality and issues that hold kids back the focus of their organization. So what is transformative leadership? In 2010, Shields defined transformative leadership as it begins with questions of justice and democracy. It critiques inequitable practices and offers the promise not only of greater individual achievement, but of a better life lived, common with others. When you talk about transformative leadership for equity is defined as a leadership approach that causes change in individuals and social systems. Transformative leadership creates valuable and positive change in the followers with the end goal of mobilizing efforts towards equity. Now, I want to share with you this slide, and this is where, please indulge me here a little bit. When I work with principals, when I work with emerging leaders, I like to say that there's 3 types of leadership. And again, I want you to think about the principals of the schools in your community, or think about the people who are the leaders of the schools that your children and grandchildren go to. Ask this question: are they transactional leaders? A transactional leader is someone who is going to focus on the immediate, the right now. They're going to make sure that things run on time. The buses arrive on time and they end on time. The lunchtime ends on time and it begins on time. Everything is ran smoothly. And their focus is to make sure that there's agreement. Their focus is to make sure that there's always calm, if you will. They want mutual agreement and benefit. That's a transactional leader. A transformational leader is someone that focuses on the organizational culture. They set goals within that organization. They redesign that organization. What motivates them is a common purpose and focus towards that organization. I like to say that a transformational leader is someone who at the end of their career will have a room named after them. They will have a scholarship named after them. They've done good work, and they've done good work in the name of that organization. They've made that organization their home. A transformative leader is someone who is deeply embedded and deeply connected with equitable change and social conditions. They deconstruct and they reconstruct frameworks that generate the inequity in their organizations, and they're constantly examining and interrogating the system. A transformative leader lives with tension. They live with challenge. It requires moral courage and activism. Now, I like to share this with our leaders because ultimately, when you look at this spectrum, this continuum, I want to be very clear. All 3 forms of leadership are hard. All 3 forms of leadership are difficult. Leadership is not easy. It's not for the meek. But when you look at the spectrum here, transactional leadership is the least important, I believe, in changing the lives of children. Transformative leadership is what we're looking for and need if we're going to truly pay the debt back to children who need it paid back. So here's just a couple of quotes that I like to use and talk about when you think about transformative leadership. So when you're thinking about this, one thing that you can do as a community is to make sure that all of our schools have transformative leaders. The other thing that I would ask you to do is to recognize, and I'm going to go back to this earlier slide, that transformative leaders live with a level of tension. They live with a level of challenge. And I was just scrolling through the names in the room here, and one of my dear friends who was a parent teacher organization leader when I was a principal was someone who constantly recognized that level of tension that I had as a transformative leader as a principal, and was always there to relieve the tension if possible. So if you're thinking about what can I do, you need to understand that a transformative leader, someone who's really trying to pay back the educational debt we owe to children, they're living with a level of tension that other leaders don't live with. And if you can relieve that tension, that's great. Another thing that you can do is to make sure that our schools are seeking and desire transformative leaders. That the age and the day of having a transactional leader is gone. We can't continue to simply rely on transactional or transformational leaders. So what can you do as a leader? And you are all leaders. You can engage in dialogue. You can continue the conversation. When Sharon reached out to me a few months ago and said, will you do this? I jumped at it simply because we need to continue the dialogue. You can engage in book circles. When you read together, you learn together. When you learn together, you understand how other people think. And from that common learning, we can change the world. You can involve and create outreach of the marginalized voices. we don't bring our historically marginalized communities to the table for decision making and for the opportunity to be part of the process. And so it's important when you are at the decision table that you ask the question, do we have all the voices here? Do we need to bring other people to the table to make sure that their voices are heard as well? We have to seek coaching. This is not easy work. And so seek coaching for an executive leadership team. That can be for a church, that can be for a business, that can be for a school. This is not, when you go back to that table that I shared with you, transformative leadership is not a natural leaning that most leaders have. And so giving them coaching is really important. And then become an ally. You can all become allies, not an advocate. Advocacy means that you can say something and then walk away. We're looking for allies. Now you may say, what's allyship? Allyship is a strategic mechanism used by individuals to become collaborators, accomplices, co-conspirators who fight injustice and promote equity in the workplace or in schools through supportive personal relationships and public acts of sponsorship and allegiance. In essence, you have to be willing to say something publicly. You have to be willing to put your stake in the ground and really be someone who's going to stand by people who have been historically marginalized in this society. And that's true allyship. I only have a couple more slides here, and then let's open it up for conversation. What direction is your leadership taking people? I ask this question because you, as leaders, you have to start asking yourself, are you continuously promoting equity or is it equality? Are you promoting liberation or nothing? And as a leader, you have to decide, what are you doing? What direction are you taking people as it pertains to getting to a goal in the promised land? I'm going to end here and stop here and see if there are any questions. But I love this question, this quote from Dantley and Tillman. And it's something that I use when I'm working with graduate students who aspire to leadership. I tell them that they have to be social justice leaders. And a social justice leader is someone who is committed to leadership that interrogates the policies and the procedures that shape schools, and at the same time perpetuate social inequalities and marginalization due to race, class, gender, and other makers of otherness. So that is the debt that we owe our children. But more importantly, I hope that you've been able to get some techniques on how we can pay back that debt. I'm going to stop my share here and open it up for questions.
Okay, I just unmuted myself. So there's a question in the chat, but I'm going to also unmute and ask people to maybe raise their hands to have a conversation. In the chat, look in there, it says, the question is, what if the system has neither equality?
Thank you both for being here. Really appreciate it.
Somebody
Really
must
informative
be-
on scale, and thank you very much. Go ahead.
Sorry.
Donald Trump tried to leave a lasting
Whoa.
impression on the Pentagon, which I
People
think we
mute
can all
themselves,
agree would have been very bad. But the absolute
Trying to
worst
mute
is the impact he
people here, but
actually
can't
did
do it.
have on career advancement for
I'm
women.
muting everybody again. Okay, I muted everybody again because somebody was really, really loud. Okay, the question then, Dr. Means, is what if the system doesn't have really any of these systems, doesn't have equality, equity, or liberation? You know, what, you're going to have to unmute yourself, but what do you do?
Then it goes back to that last slide that I shared around being a social justice leader. You have to start interrogating the system and pointing out to the system what needs to change. As a veteran superintendent, I can tell you that there are school board meetings across this state and country where there are committed citizens who come to school board meetings every month, and they cite the same concerns. And some of those concerns are dismissed by school board members and superintendents, and sometimes they're not. you have to be consistent. If you know that your system doesn't even have equality, then you have to start rising up. And going back to that slide that I shared in terms of the strategies you can use, ultimately you have to start engaging people in dialogue.
Yeah, specifically, regarding the the equality thing, when I think about the differences between suburban school districts and urban school districts, and um, the funding basis for schools, um, where we use property taxes, and you have some communities that don't have enough resources um, to provide the amount of money that's needed.
And so I think there's a lot of opportunities for allies to advocate around funding for schools. I think the fact that we fund our schools based on property value uh, exacerbates the inequality that we have across the nation. And there's other funding formulas that other states use. The state of Wisconsin has it seems about every 10 years or so, and I see a good friend, Ms. Woodward, from, I believe, Whitefish Bay. I don't know if you're still on the board in Whitefish Bay, but I think you've been part of those conversations where we've constantly, about every 10 years in the state of Wisconsin, we talk about if we want to have the courage to look at a different type of funding formula, and we typically walk away from it. And the end result is that we continue to exacerbate the situation of the haves and have-nots in our state.
Another question was, what does, we go back up here and find this. Is Act 10 one of the reasons Wisconsin is so far behind?
We were behind prior to Act 10. We were the lowest in the country in terms of Black students performance on the national assessment, even prior to Act 10. But I think it has hurt us more because Act 10 has made Wisconsin not as attractive of a destination for teachers. And one of our challenges right now is that we have a teacher shortage. We have a bad pipeline in terms of teachers, in particular teachers of color. And it's been really difficult to um, encourage teachers of color to come to the state of Wisconsin. And so I think it would be disingenuous for us to say that Act 10 has not hurt the teaching profession. It has made it less attractive to prospective teachers. And we lost a lot of teachers on the heels of Act 10. A lot of good teachers decided to walk away. And I remember having considerable conversations with teachers who said, I don't have to take this anymore. I can go in the private sector and make twice as much. I was giving back. And so I think that from that perspective, Act 10 did not help our challenge here in the state of Wisconsin.
Another question is, what's the role of public financing in reaching the goal of equity? Is that we need to switch to that in your view?
Well, I think again that goes back to the funding formula concept that we've been discussing here. I think funding is critical. Resources are critical. There's been a lot of research that has been completed in the last 3 years that shows that when teachers and students and families are able to engage with content-rich material, so new computers, new textbooks, just really strong instructional materials, that learning increases. So we know that that's important. Well, the only way you can get those types of materials is through paying for it. You need resources for it. I think the other component is we have to start having the conversation that in order to attract and draw the best talent, you have to compensate the best talent. And so this concept of teachers should do it for the love of teaching, that's what education is one of the few professions, if not, if the only profession in our nation where we assume that people should do it for the love of it. Everyone else is they're seeking appropriate compensation for the work that they do. And I think if we start approaching the issue of paying back the educational debt by ensuring that our kids have the best materials, they have the best facilities to attend school, and that they have the best educators who are being treated well and professionally, I think you'll start seeing an uptick.
Another question was, how did Wisconsin end up being on the bottom?
I don't know. I think, I looked in the chat here, and someone made this the statement I'm reading here: because Milwaukee is the largest city in Wisconsin and Milwaukee is so segregated, I'm still learning what can be done, because it seems that all sides cannot agree how to move forward. All sides need to buck up and quit being stubborn. I think one of the challenges here is that we've been in and I think the contributor to that question is getting to something, which is we've been in the midst of battles around educational platforms and the city of Milwaukee in particular, but the state of Wisconsin, for almost 40 years now. And we have known that there were challenges with our educational system for many years. And, many of you on the line will recognize this term, but the Chapter 220 program was an attempt to address some of the inequities that we recognized in the larger system. But that, it's really interesting. I like to point out to people that the second phase, the full phasing of the Chapter 220 program, didn't happen until the 1990s. The late 1980s, 1990s. That second lawsuit wasn't really completed until late 1986, 1987, with implementation happening. And when I say the second phase, that's when the second ring suburbs, places like Menominee Falls, Germantown, Mequon, Thiensville, those places, they didn't get engaged in the Chapter 220 program until the late 80s, early 90s. And then in a very quiet, unceremoniously way for it to go away, it just went away in a budget bill in about 6 years ago. It went away, and now they're sunsetting it. And so I think this conversation, and allies like yourselves, you have to start speaking up more. You have to start asking questions of your elected officials around the issues of educational funding, and why why do we have, you guys are asking the right questions. Why are we having the worst? Why do we have the worst achievement gap in the state, in the United States, for Black kids? I see someone asking the question, are the white students in Wisconsin on the bottom? No, they're not. When you disaggregate white students on that national assessment, they're not, they do well. It's very similar to that slide I showed you in the presentation around the PISA. White students are doing well. Sharon, or whoever's controlling the questions, I see George he's been raising his hand for a while.
Oh, let me go ahead. I gotta find George and unmute him.
I can do it. Thank you, Dr. Means. I have nothing against charter or choice schools. I think you have a right to send your children where you want to send them, but we talked about funding. And one of the things that I don't like about it, because some of those schools aren't good schools. And if you have a bad student or a student that's not adapting well to that, MPS cannot refuse to take that child back. They have to take that child back. But when they leave MPS to go to those schools, that funding follows them. And it upsets me. And me and my brother discuss this all the time. I don't know if you know Gary Lawson or not. That's my brother.
Okay.
And what troubles me is that when they come back to MPS, that money should come back to MPS, so that money is slowly being siphoned off and stays out there with those schools instead of coming back to MPS. And I would like to know, is there anything that could be done about that?
Well, I think what I would say is that is really we have. I'm going to try to stay general and not get into the sector wars or speak about certain school systems in particular. What I would say is that the concept and the theme of the presentation is that we owe an educational debt to all children. If you saw that title, in terms of how the specific system works, I think it's important for us to keep a level of support. I don't like using the word accountability because I think accountability has a negative connotation, but I think we need to have a level of support and coaching available to all schools to make sure that they're serving students appropriately and they're meeting their needs. And I think there's also, and it goes back to our conversation around funding. We have to make sure that the issue of funding is not the challenge for educators, regardless of the school that kids go to. That can't be in the most wealthiest nation on the globe. That cannot be our challenge. Our challenge shouldn't be that we're refusing to invest in our children to the point that we're not providing the appropriate funding for resources and facilities and staff. I think we have to start looking at it from that level. And because it's not just how much you get per student, it's also, I can attest to the fact that when you have strong facilities, when you have good facilities, it does something to your culture. It does something to your school culture. Yeah, I once worked with a principal who wanted their school painted every year during the summer. And I realized after the second year what that person was doing. That principal was setting a tone. When you have a freshly painted, I mean, think about your homes. If you have a painter come in and repaint the house, you kind of feel a little bit different about your house. It's a little brighter. You have a little bit more of a pep in your step. That holds true for kids. We should not be in a position where our kids are not being invested in by our society.
Yeah, there was this comment about the fact that no one expects a return on investment, and that determines how much is invested. So they're just low expectations that kind of a vicious cycle.
Well, and I think the low expectation goes back to what we talked about in the beginning of the presentation, which is that's why we need transformative leaders. We need transformative leaders who are going to interrogate and look for the inequalities in our system. And we don't need transactional leaders anymore. We don't need people who are just looking for the mutual benefit and to move away. Again, I don't want to be disparaging towards those people because leadership is difficult. But if you are a leader who is simply there to make the trains run on time, you're perpetuating and adding to the problem. You're not helping the problem. I think Mr. Jones has his hand up.
Andrew?
Yeah, I think you almost you kind of answered that. I was an educator for 14 years, not in Milwaukee, but in the St. Louis area. And I think your point's well made that this is not a local problem, it's a national problem. And one of the things that you had said was about funding is if it's just an issue of funding, the debt that you're talking about is happening in affluent schools and schools where there is a lot of money in the district. And so when you talk about transformational leadership, one of the things I was thinking about was that needs to happen on all levels, which is why that idea of allyship is so important, because you can have a great teacher, but if they have administrators who are saying, parents are complaining, you need to do it this way. It needs to be at the teaching level, at the administrative level, at the district board level, and of course at the state level, because so much of that is operated by state laws and things like that. So.
I
So-
see there's a quote. Thank you, Mr. Jones. There's a question in the chat that says, so what can we do? I just want to go over those 5 components one more time. The first is you can engage in dialogue, and you need to stay sustained in that dialogue. You cannot let it go. We have it. The only way you make a difference, so from a social movement standpoint, is if you sustain the movement. You have to sustain the conversation, and you're going to get tired. It is draining. You have to find time to rest. You have to have partners who are going to say, I will take up the mantle for the next week or two. You go rest and be with your family. But after 2 weeks, we need you back. When you look at any social movement in our country, it is part of a sustained dialogue. So that's the first thing that we have to do. The second that I shared with you is that we have to engage in book circles. We have to learn together. This is a learning environment tonight where we're learning. Book circles, I like book circles because now everyone is hearing the same or reading the same material and then bringing that material to the conversation. The third is we have to reach out. We have to do outreach to communities that are historically marginalized, and we know they're historically marginalized. Many of us sit at the table of decision making. Many of us are at the table when decisions around our society are being made. Many of us, if we don't sit at the table, we know who to call to make sure that that call is being made. And so it's important that you ensure that voice is uplifted. And I'll give you a real, you may say, well, what is he talking about? I'll give you an example. Tragically, the young man who was murdered a couple of weekends ago on Wisconsin Avenue. I don't know if some of you saw that news coverage. Young man who just recently graduated from the University of Wisconsin Whitewater. He was a member of my collegiate fraternity. And I realized that sometimes young people who are either part of the undergraduate process or just recently graduated, they don't have access to the leaders of the national organization of the fraternity. And so in order to represent and to involve and to ensure that potentially marginalized community was heard, I reached out to the national leadership to say, do you know one of our members was murdered in Milwaukee in a tragedy? Do you know this? What can the organization do? Now, that's a very small example, but what I'm sharing with you is you all know people. You all know decision makers, and you need to challenge decision makers to say, are you engaging every voice? Have you received the opinion of everyone? That's a third thing you can do. The fourth is you have to provide coaching to your leaders. You have to ask your leaders, are you being coached? Are you getting better? It's important for you to ask your leader, and not in a derogatory way, not in a challenging way, but in a way of saying, I want you to get better. I want you to improve. How can I help you? How can I assist? And in particular, how can I assist you getting better in an area like dealing with race, dealing with otherness, dealing with topics that we typically don't train leaders to do and lead in. And then finally, you have to become an ally. And we talked about what becoming an ally means. And that's hard. Those are the 5 things you can do.
I have a question. If you take a look and say you want to do these things, but you're trying to say, what are the maybe 5 things that are kind of specific that if you look at Milwaukee would need to change to try to make our school system better?
Well, what I would say is that the narrative, I just arrived back from the state of Georgia, where I was a school superintendent there. And in Georgia, they talk about Atlanta. And, you pick the state. In Michigan, they talk about Detroit. in Minneapolis, or excuse me, in Minnesota, they talk about Minneapolis, St. Paul, and those two school districts. Wisconsin's no different than any other than those states. In Indiana, they talk about the Indianapolis public schools. In Massachusetts, they talk about the Boston public schools. This is an issue that is not just constrained to our one major metropolitan school system, because the national assessment where Wisconsin does the worst in the country, you have to keep in mind they pull the scores of Black students from Mequon-Thiensville. They pull the scores of Black kids who attend Whitefish Bay and Nicolay and Heartland Arrowhead. They pull the Black kids from the entire state. So this is not a one school district issue. This is a statewide issue. And candidly, it's a national issue. If you go back and remember that slide I shared with you in terms of how Black kids do on on that international assessment compared to everyone else in the country. This is, I think what we have to do is widen our scope and not focus on one district. That's the low-hanging fruit. What we have to do is really start elevating our conversation to say, what are we going to do to pay back that educational debt everywhere?
So is racism then, does it just permeate no matter what school district you're in, and impact then how these students look at education, or how they feel they can learn, or how they feel empowered by teachers?
I think we would be fooling ourselves. And I'm a former history teacher. Our nation has never completed and finished the conversation around race. We've never completed it. We had a civil war, and then we had Reconstruction, and I think many people learned through the past presidential election. And Reconstruction ended as a result of a deal that was struck between the two political parties, and in order to keep the peace on the national political front, one political party said, okay, we're done enforcing the laws that created peace through Reconstruction. And then that ushered in an era of Jim Crow that lasted over 100 years. So we went from slavery to a brief period of Reconstruction to Jim Crow. And then we got to a point where we said the 1964 Civil Rights Act, that's going to be the panacea. And it hasn't been. And we continue to have laws that are either rolled back or we don't complete the conversation. And so when you think about things like the Chapter 220 program that was rolled back, and there wasn't an uprising from the electorate, there wasn't enough people who said, what are you doing? We need this program. That's where we need to start having sustained conversations. So that's just a couple of thoughts here. I'm reading from Mr. Poole here. Do you think that using ethnic label metrics create barriers to achieving equitable funding? What I would say is that the No Child Left Behind law from 2002, 2001, 2002 was meant to really hone in on looking at the data of each individual student group. It didn't impact things, but what we didn't do is that we didn't encourage leaders to be transformative leaders, Mr. Poole, and saying, okay, you have a challenge. How are you going to address that challenge with that group of students? What we were doing in education was we continued to use the equality approach. So I'm going to take your question a little bit by saying there are some funding models out there that would say you have to invest more resources in students with special needs. You have to invest more resources in students who have a hearing impairment. And you may have to invest more money in students who are coming to your classrooms with maybe a 2 or 3 year gap or lag in where they should be reading wise. So you may have a kid who's in the 5th grade reading at the 2nd grade reading level. What I would like to do is not segregate those kids in our schools, because we haven't talked about that, but we segregate kids in our schools. What I would rather do is invest more money in those kids so they can rise up and meet the great promise that they have in them.
I don't know enough about Wisconsin, but in some areas and in some districts, I know that students who are bused to a school are segregated once they get to school. And they're given a different quality of education when they get to that high quality school.
Yes, it was one of the things that has broken my heart the most, but also encouraged me to become more of a transformative leader. In my experience, there are kids who attend some of the best schools in our state. They all enter the same schoolhouse door, but once they enter that schoolhouse door, they have a very different experience educationally. We segregate kids. And so what I mean by segregating kids is that we put them on tracks, and we have them on really high paced tracks. We tell the kids who are struggling with reading, okay, you have to go somewhere else. You go to the reading teacher. And as early as kindergarten, the kids know who's being pulled out of their classroom and who's not. And so I like to always say, if you have a classroom, let's just imagine you have a classroom of 20. And if you have 5 kids who are special needs, they're being pulled out and taken by the special ed teacher. You have 3 kids who have, they're not special ed, but they have reading challenges. Now they're pulled out into the hallway. Oh, by the way, there's 4 kids who are gifted and talented. They're pulled out of the classroom. Out of a just this model classroom of 20, once all the pullouts are done, you only have a class of 8 kids. And what happens, unfortunately, is that then the kids know who they are, and there's a stigma, and we're just perpetuating what I believe is what Brown versus the Board of Education was trying to fight, which is we're segregating. We've learned how to segregate kids within our schools, and we don't talk about this. That's why one of the strategies we have to commit to is sustained dialogue. Dr. Marshall is going to be speaking to you next week about healthcare, and everybody who's an expert in a certain field feel that their field is the best, and their field is the most important. And Dr. Marshall is going to give you passion beyond belief around health care disparities, which are some of the worst here in Wisconsin, in the country. I get that. As an educator, I'm just here to share with you, I believe there's a clear linkage between how we owe this debt to our children and what the social realities are in our communities.
I can get them up here. I'll plug them back in. The only 2?
I think Sharon has her hand up.
Yes, thank you. And then
I do. To change the subject slightly or expand the discussion, you talked about the importance of a teacher. And indeed, all over the country, there are wonderful stories about the difference that a teacher made in a child's life forever. My question is, for a child that comes in marred and scarred, either from outside circumstances, inside circumstances, whatever, are there programs or teachers? How do you reach that child? And what can we as a community do to help in that process? There are 2 different questions, but it's so important at some point to reach each and every child. And when a child gets lost somewhere along the line, what are the avenues that are being used now, and how can they be strengthened to increase finding that child, helping them along the way?
I believe that when you, and many of you are from the business sector, and the private sector, I think the portfolio of educators is unreasonable. We put a lot on our educators and expect them to work miracles. And so what I would suggest is that the more we can invest in school counselors, social workers. When I was in Clark County in Georgia, we had a school nurse for every school, because you would be surprised what kids tell the school nurse. The more we can put structures in place where we're supporting our young people, I don't think it's about programs, it's about people. And in order to get high quality people, you have to pay them. So it goes back to that financial conversation. And I think the other thing is just not pay, because educators will tell you, I'm not in this for pay. A lot of educators will tell you, you don't have to pay me top dollar. Just give me a reasonable workload. You know, don't make me a special ed teacher and then give me 25 kids on my caseload. That I can't service those students appropriately. If you give me a caseload of 8, now maybe I can really dig deep and figure it out. And so I think that's really, it's really important and good to know. Dr. Marshall knows this, but my mother's a public health nurse. And so I like to always ask questions around the healthcare industry. A nurse on a hospital floor doesn't have the entire floor of patients to take care of, but that's what we do to teachers. We'll say, well, you should take 20 of them and work magic. Good luck. No, in the healthcare field, they give you a reasonable amount of patients on a portfolio. So then you can think, you can be strategic, you can think about what that patient needs to do the work of healing them. And if we're trying to pay back our educational debt and heal children, then it's really important that we give our educators the right caseload. So I don't think it's about programs. It's about making sure that we have the right people there to support them and that those people are not overloaded.
There's a question here about a couple of questions. One about would helping Black businesses help the schools? Another one about how much falls on the parents' involvement. So kind of empowering some allies, I guess, among Black business and among parents. What do you think about that?
Family and community engagement is critical. We know that there's research that shows that when you authentically engage families and communities and make them part of the process, and that they're at the table when decisions are being made, that things change. They just simply change. The research is clear. And so we have to make sure that the families and communities where historically marginalized people live also have that access. In terms of entrepreneurship and business, Junior Achievement's doing something really interesting. I'm not a real big fan of programs, but they have something called 3DE, and it's a program through Junior Achievement where they're teaching young people how to be entrepreneurs, and they embed that work within their coursework. And at the end of their 4-year study, they have entrepreneur opportunities beyond just learning about it. They get apprenticeships and they get jobs, and it really puts them on a launch pad for success.
That's a good idea. Okay, I'm trying to think if does anybody else want to pose a question? I think you can unmute yourself and just ask, so feel free.
I just have a comment about the parent involvement. One of the things that I think is really important in the parent involvement is to make sure that all parents have the opportunity and can be involved. So when you're thinking about that, you need to think about, can the parents get there? Do the parents have jobs? What hours are they available? Who's at home with the other children? So it's not just assuming that all parents are going to have equal opportunity to be involved. And otherwise you get, you don't get the whole picture of the group.
Sandy, you're absolutely right. We actually perpetuate inequities by by having PTO meetings during the day. You know, so when you have parent teacher organizations during the day, you're actually perpetuating the challenge, because a lot of our families have to work. They don't have the ability, and that's not a judgment on families who have the ability to attend those meetings or the families who can't. It's just a reality of, we have a lot of working families. The other thing, this is really simple. This is really simple, but we have to stop using the term parent or mom and dad in schools. We have to start using terminology like, who's the caregiver in a family. I'll give you a prime example. My mother-in-law is raising a niece and nephew of mine from my wife's side of the family. She's not the parent, and you know, my wife's an educator. I'm an educator. It was really interesting to see how nervous my mother-in-law would get when it was time to go to teacher-parent conferences. It got to a point where she would say, I think I need you guys to attend with me, because she was intimidated. It was not an environment that was welcoming to her as that caregiver. So there's just a lot of work that can be done. What I would say in closing, because Sharon, I think you said we needed to wrap up around 8:10, 8:15. What I would share is this. I would challenge this group, and at our height, we were a little over 100 participants on the call this evening. I would encourage this group to come back together before the start of next school year. Because next school year, I believe, it will become an important school year for our country. Next school year, we won't have leaders who are overwhelmed with figuring out COVID protocols. Next year, we won't have leaders and teachers who are overwhelmed with what they've had to go through this year. We will be at some level of normalcy. It won't be the way it was in February of 2020 before this all hit us, but it will be closer to it than it is now. And we've had stop and go efforts in this community around promoting good public education and education for kids. What I would encourage this group to do is to come back together before the start of the school year to have this conversation again. It's not, this was a good start, but I would want to revisit this conversation, so then I would want to go deeper with this group and talk about, so when do you go to a school board? How do you write your school board member or your school superintendent? What do you say to that individual to become that ally? That's the next step. I've given you 5 strategies that you can use to make the change. I would just encourage us and challenge you to think about coming back together in the late summer, early fall, when school starts, to say, so what are we going to do? Because we do owe an educational debt to all of our children.
Can I just make a real quick statement that at our church, we have a tutoring program at a minority school. And we've had 40 tutors every year until COVID. And we have 18 tutors working now virtually every week, helping these kids. But to follow up on George Lawson's comment, is that when the students come back, and they don't come back after they've been at a choice school and they're sent back to MPS, they don't come back with their files either. They don't come back with the money, and the poor school is stuck there with the children. They don't have their backgrounds. So it's really, that's a big issue that needs to be corrected in the schools. And the school, of course, isn't going to complain because they're going to get a black mark on them, but it's these teachers are going above and beyond. And we have to really kudos to the church and the program that they have for we're in 23rd year. And many of the people in this group are tutors at the school and do a fabulous job.
Okay, listen, Dr. Means, thank you so much. This has been very challenging and thoughtful conversation. Now we've got some things to think about ourselves, I think. But I think we're challenged to come back together. We'll have to talk about how we can do that.
Let's sustain the conversation,
Yeah,
everybody.
yeah.
Thank you for the
What are
opportunity.
you doing on August 21st?
Yeah, we'll find a date. Yeah, we need you to come back too to help us. So,
If you bring me back, I'll come back. Thank you so much, everybody.
okay. Okay, well, thank you. Thanks, everybody, for attending, and we hope we can see you next week for Dr. Marshall.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Means.